You are listening to Craziest HOA Moments. I wish this was exaggerated. I stepped outside with my shovel, and the cold hit my face like a slap. The snowbank I had just cleared sat 3 feet from the shared mailbox cluster at the curb. Barbara Williams was already out of her car, marching across the icy street toward my driveway with her phone raised like a weapon and her mouth already open. Your sidewalk is too narrow, and I am writing you up for obstruction. I blinked. My sidewalk was the same width it had been for 15 years. I am a plumber, I work long shifts, and I had just spent 40 minutes clearing a path wide enough for a wheelchair. The snow I shoveled had to go somewhere, so I piled it between my driveway apron and the mailbox post. Barbara stopped 2 feet from me, her red puffer coat zipped to her chin, her breath coming out in angry puffs. "That pile is a violation," she said. "It blocks access to the mailbox. I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it." I looked at the mailbox. The door was completely clear. The pile was offset by at least 2 feet. I said, "The mail carrier can reach it fine." She shook her head hard enough that her low bun wobbled. "Your snow is on common property. That is grounds for immediate fines, and I am already drafting the notice." She held up her phone and started tapping with one gloved finger. I could see the edge of a glove box envelope stuffed with certified mail slips peeking out of her coat pocket. I planted the shovel in the snow and said, "Barbara, I just moved the snow off my driveway. Where else am I supposed to put it?" She pointed at the mailbox cluster. "You put it on association property. That is a winter compliance violation under Section 12-4. I am the pool and amenities chair, and I control access like a bouncer, which means I enforce the rules when I see them broken." She tapped her phone screen again and said, "I am sending this to the board right now." I said, "There is no Section 12-4. I read the rules last month." She smiled without warmth. "The rules were updated at the last meeting. You would know that if you attended." I had not attended because I was working a burst pipe emergency in a building across town. I said, "When was the meeting?" 2 weeks ago, she said. "Minutes are posted online. Check the portal." I made a mental note to do exactly that. Barbara stepped closer, her boots crunching on the ice. She said, "You have 24 hours to move that snow, or I am escalating this to enforcement. That means fines, vendor penalties, and a tow if your car is parked in violation during the next storm response cycle." I said, "My car is in my garage." She waved that away. "You have stakes along your driveway, reflective markers, those are prohibited." I stared at her. I had installed 6 small reflective snow stakes so the plow contractor would not tear up my grass. I said, "They are to protect my lawn." "They are not approved," Barbara said. "I am writing that up too." She turned and walked back toward her car, talking over her shoulder. "You will get the notice in certified mail. Do not ignore it, or I will assume you are in willful non-compliance." She climbed into her sedan and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway with a shovel in one hand and a knot of anger in my chest. The wind picked up and I felt the cold seep through my gloves. I looked at the snow pile. It was not blocking anything. The mailbox door was clear, the street was clear, and the sidewalk was wider than code required. I went inside and pulled up the Driftwood Crossing Estates Association portal on my laptop. The minutes from the last meeting were posted, but when I opened the file, I saw something strange. The document metadata showed it had been edited 3 days after the meeting date. I scrolled through and found a line about winter snow removal that had not been there before. It said all snow removed from private driveways must be kept entirely within the property line and may not encroach on common areas including mailbox zones. I took a screenshot. Then I opened my email and saw a notice from the post office that I had certified mail waiting for pickup. I grabbed my keys and drove to the station. The clerk handed me a thick envelope with Barbara's return address. Inside was a winter violation notice that read like a ransom note. The language was dense and threatening, packed with references to sections that did not exist in the version of the rules I had downloaded a month ago. The deadline was 48 hours, not 24. The fine was $300, escalating to $500 if I did not comply within 72 hours. I sat in my truck and called my neighbor Dennis. He is a retired police officer and he lives 2 doors down. I said, "Dennis, I need your advice." He answered on the second ring, "What is going on?" I explained the snow pile, the stakes, the edited minutes, and the notice. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "That is harassment. She is changing the rules after the fact and using enforcement as a weapon. You need to document everything. Take pictures of the snow pile, the mailbox, the stakes, and the notice. Get a third-party inspection if you can afford it." I said, "What kind of inspection?" "Code compliance," he said. "Hire someone who can measure your sidewalk, confirm the mailbox access, and write a report that proves you are not in violation. It costs money, but it is worth it if she escalates." I thanked him and hung up. Then I called a local inspection service and scheduled an appointment for the next morning. The inspector was a gray-haired man named Tom who showed up with a clipboard, a tape measure, and a camera. He spent 20 minutes measuring my sidewalk, checking the mailbox clearance, and photographing the snow pile from multiple angles. He said, "You are not in violation of any code I know. Your sidewalk is 4 feet wide, which exceeds the minimum. The mailbox door has full access. The snow pile is on the curb strip, which is technically common property, but it is standard practice during winter. Every house on this street has snow piled in the same spot." I said, "Can you put that in a report?" He nodded. "I will have it to you by tonight." That afternoon, I received another certified mail notice. This one was from the Driftwood Crossing Management Company. It said my account had been flagged for non-compliance and that a lien would be placed on my property if I did not resolve the violations within 10 days. I called the management company and asked to speak to someone in charge. The woman on the phone said, "We are just enforcing what the board tells us. If you have a dispute, you need to take it up with the board directly." I said, "The board is changing the rules after meetings and using them to harass me." She said, "That is a board matter. We do not get involved in policy disputes." I hung up and opened my laptop. I drafted an email to the full board, attaching the screenshot of the edited minutes and the inspection report Tom had sent me. I wrote, "I am requesting a formal hearing to dispute the winter violations issued by Barbara Williams. The attached report proves I am in compliance. The minutes you posted were edited after the meeting, which raises serious questions about the integrity of your enforcement process. I am also requesting copies of all unedited meeting minutes and correspondence related to winter snow removal policy." I hit send and waited. 2 hours later, I got a reply from the board president, who was not Barbara. His name was Greg. He said, "Your hearing is scheduled for next Thursday at 7 p.m. Bring all documentation. Be prepared to answer questions." I replied, "I will be there." That night, I went outside to move my truck into the garage. The plow contractor only has one service window, and missing it means I am buried until morning, so I wanted to make sure my driveway was clear and my vehicle was not in the way. As I was backing in, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A tow truck was idling at the end of my driveway. Barbara was standing next to the driver, pointing at my house. I put the truck in park and got out. I said, "What is going on?" Barbara turned and said, "Your vehicle was parked in violation during the last storm cycle. I called for removal." I said, "My truck has been in the garage for 3 days." She pointed at the curb. "Your snow pile is obstructing the plow path. That is a towing violation under the emergency access rule." The tow operator stepped out of his cab. He was a big guy with a beard and a reflective vest. He looked at the snow pile, then at me, then at Barbara. He said, "Ma'am, that pile is not blocking anything. The plow can go around it." Barbara said, "It is a violation. I am directing you to remove his vehicle." The operator shook his head. "I am not towing a vehicle that is legally parked in a private garage. If you want to dispute the snow pile, that is between you and him. I am not getting involved." Barbara's face went red. She said, "I am calling management, and I am going to be dramatic about it." She pulled out her phone and started dialing. The operator looked at me and said, "Sorry, man, I do not do HOA drama." He climbed back into his truck and drove off. Barbara stayed on the curb, talking into her phone in a loud voice. I heard her say, "He is refusing to comply and now he is obstructing enforcement. I need escalation authority." I pulled out my own phone and started recording. I kept the camera low and steady, pointed at Barbara and the snow pile. She did not notice. She kept talking, pacing back and forth on the icy curb. I let her say my name loud because later I wanted it on the recording. After 5 minutes, she hung up and walked to her car without saying another word to me. I went inside and saved the video to 3 different places. Then I called Dennis and told him what had happened. He said, "That is attempted towing without cause. If she tries it again, call the police and file a harassment report." The next morning, I woke up to another certified mail notice. This one said my snow stakes were being treated as unpermitted structures and that I had 72 hours to remove them, or face a $500 fine. I pulled on my boots and went outside. The stakes were still there, standing in a neat line along my driveway. Each one was 18 inches tall, bright orange, and completely harmless. I took pictures of each stake, the driveway, and the surrounding properties. 3 other houses on my street had identical stakes. I sent the photos to Dennis and asked if he could be a witness at the hearing. He said, "Absolutely, I will be there." That afternoon, a surprise inspection crew showed up at my porch. 2 men in reflective vests with clipboards and an attitude knocked on my door and said they were there to inspect my winter compliance. I asked who sent them. One of them said, "The association. We are contracted for enforcement inspections." I said, "Do you have a warrant or any legal authority to enter my property?" He said, "We are just doing our job." I said, "Then you can do it from the curb. You are not coming inside." He looked annoyed, but he stepped back. They spent 10 minutes walking around the perimeter of my property, taking notes and photos. I watched them from the window. When they were done, they got into a white van with no markings and drove off. I called the management company and asked who authorized the inspection. The woman on the phone said, "The board has enforcement authority under the governing documents. If you have a complaint, take it to the hearing." I said, "This is harassment." She said, "That is your opinion." I hung up and went back to my laptop. I opened the association portal and started digging through old meeting minutes. I found the minutes from the meeting Barbara had referenced. The original file, before the edits, was still cached in my browser. I saved a copy. The original version had no mention of mailbox zones or snow pile restrictions. The edited version, posted 3 days later, had an entire paragraph inserted. That was my trump card. I did not tell anyone about it yet. I wanted to hold it until the right moment. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday night at the community center. I arrived early with a folder full of documents, the inspection report, the photos, the video of Barbara and the tow truck, the screenshots of the edited minutes, and a timeline of every interaction. Dennis came with me. He was wearing a clean shirt and a serious expression. He said, "Just stay calm and let them talk first. Do not lose your temper." The board was seated at a long table at the front of the room. Greg, the board president, was in the center. Barbara was on his right, looking smug. There were 3 other board members I did not recognize. About a dozen neighbors were sitting in the audience. I recognized a few faces. Greg called the meeting to order and said, "We are here to address the winter compliance violations issued to the property at 42 Snowberry Lane. The homeowner has requested a hearing." He gestured to me. "You have 10 minutes to present your case." I stood up and walked to the front. I said, I received multiple violation notices for snow removal and reflective stakes. I hired a third-party inspector who confirmed I am in full compliance with all code requirements. I have photos, measurements, and a written report. I also have video evidence that Barbara Williams attempted to have my vehicle towed without cause. Barbara leaned forward. Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth. I looked at her and said, your minutes were edited after the meeting. I have proof. Greg frowned. What are you talking about? I pulled out the screenshots and walked them up to the table. I said, the minutes posted on the portal show an edit date 3 days after the meeting. The section about mailbox zones was not in the original version. I have a cached copy of the original file. Barbara's face went pale. She said, that is not true. The minutes were corrected for clarity. I said, corrected or invented? Greg looked at the screenshots, then at Barbara. He said, Barbara, did you edit the minutes after the meeting? She hesitated. I said, I clarified the language. The policy was discussed, I just made sure it was clear in the final version. Greg said, you cannot add new policy language after a vote. That is not how this works. Barbara said, it was implied in the discussion. I said, implied is not the same as voted on and recorded. You invented a rule to justify fining me. One of the other board members, a woman named Carol, said, if the minutes were edited, we need to see the original. This is a serious procedural issue. Barbara said, I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it. Greg held up a hand. Barbara, stop. He looked at me and said, do you have the original file? I said, yes. I can email it to you right now. He nodded. Send it. I pulled out my phone and sent the file to the board email address. Greg opened his laptop and pulled it up. He read for a minute, then he looked at Barbara and said, this is bad. You added an entire paragraph. That is not a clarification. That is fabrication. Barbara stood up. I did what I thought was necessary to enforce the rules. Greg said, you do not get to invent rules. That is not your job. Barbara grabbed her glove box envelope and said, I have sent 40 certified notices this winter. I have documentation on every single violation. I am doing my job. Dennis stood up from the audience and said, excuse me, I am Dennis Park, retired police officer. I live 2 doors down from the homeowner. I have observed Barbara Williams engage in targeted harassment, including an attempted towing without legal cause and multiple threats on camera. Her behavior crosses the line into intimidation. Greg rubbed his face. He said, this is a mess. He looked at me and said, your violations are dismissed. The board will review the minutes and the winter policy. Barbara, you are stepping back from enforcement pending an internal review. Barbara said, you cannot do that. Greg said, I just did. Barbara stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The audience erupted in whispers. Carol leaned over and said something to Greg. He nodded and said, we are going to take a 10-minute recess. During the recess, 3 other neighbors came up to me and said they had received similar notices from Barbara. One of them, a woman named Linda, said she fined me $200 for having my trash cans out 15 minutes early. I paid it because I did not want the fight. I said, you should request a refund. She said, can I do that? I said, after tonight, yes. When the meeting reconvened, Greg said, the board is going to conduct a full audit of all winter enforcement actions taken this season. Any fines issued under the edited policy will be refunded. We are also implementing a new procedure for meeting minutes that requires review and approval before posting. I said, what about the harassment? Greg said, we will address that separately. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic, but I knew Barbara was not done. 2 days later, I received another certified mail notice. This one said my driveway snow stakes were still in violation and that enforcement would proceed unless I removed them immediately. I called Greg and said, I thought the violations were dismissed. He said, they are. Ignore that notice. Barbara sent it before the board meeting. It has no legal standing. I said, she is still sending notices? He sighed. We are working on it. That night, I got a call from Dennis. He said, you need to come outside. Now? I pulled on my boots and went out. Dennis was standing at the end of my driveway holding a flashlight. He pointed at my mailbox. Someone had taped a notice to the post. It was another violation notice, this one handwritten. It said final warning in bold letters at the top. I pulled it down and saw Barbara's signature at the bottom. Dennis said, she is escalating. You need to file a restraining order. I said, can I do that? He said, you have video, witnesses, and a pattern of harassment. You can absolutely do that. I will help you with the paperwork. The next morning, I went to the courthouse and filed a petition for a temporary restraining order against Barbara Williams. The clerk said, you will get a hearing date within 2 weeks. Bring all your evidence. I said, I have plenty. That same day, my certified mail arrived late because of weather. It was another thick envelope from Barbara. Inside was a notice saying my snow pile was now being treated as an abandoned property hazard and that the association would remove it at my expense if I did not act within 24 hours. I took a picture of the notice and sent it to Greg with a note that said, this is after the board meeting. She is ignoring your directive. Greg replied, I am scheduling an emergency board meeting for Monday. This ends now. On Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine. I looked out the window and saw a tow truck backing into my driveway. Barbara was standing on the curb, directing the driver like an air traffic controller. I grabbed my phone and ran outside. I said, stop. What are you doing? The driver said, I was told to remove a vehicle in violation. I said, there is no violation. This is harassment. Barbara said, your truck is parked in an unapproved location. I said, my truck is in my garage. She pointed at my second vehicle, a work van I keep parked in the driveway. She said, that vehicle is in violation of overnight parking rules. I said, there is no overnight parking rule. Barbara pulled out her phone and said, it was added at the last meeting. I said, the meeting where you edited the minutes? She glared at me. Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth. The tow operator looked uncomfortable. He said, look, I need proof of a violation before I hook anything. I said, I have proof there is no violation. I pulled up the inspection report on my phone and showed it to him. He read it, then looked at Barbara and said, I am not doing this. Barbara said, I am calling management and I am going to be dramatic about it. The operator climbed into his truck and drove off. Barbara stood on the curb, shaking with rage. I kept my phone recording. She turned to me and said, you think you are clever. You think you can fight the board. But I control access to the pool, the gym, and the mailroom. I can make your life miserable. I said, you already tried that. It did not work. She stepped closer. I said, do not come any closer. I am recording this. She stopped. She said, I do not care about your recording. I have 40 certified notices. I have the board behind me. I said, you do not have the board behind you. They dismissed the violations. They are auditing your enforcement. And I filed for a restraining order. Her face went blank. She said, you what? I said, I filed a petition for a temporary restraining order. The hearing is next week. You will get served any day now. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She turned and walked to her car without another word. I watched her drive off, then I went inside and called Dennis. I said, she just tried to tow my van. He said, did you get it on video? I said, every second. He said, good. That is going to help your case. That afternoon, Greg called me and said, "The board met in emergency session. We voted to freeze all enforcement actions pending a full policy rewrite. Barbara is suspended from the board effective immediately. We are also referring her conduct to the management company for further review." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means she is done. She will not be issuing any more notices." 2 days later, a process server showed up at Barbara's door and handed her the restraining order petition. I was not there, but Linda texted me and said she screamed at the guy for 5 minutes. It was beautiful. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I showed up with Dennis, my folder of documents, and the video files on a flash drive. Barbara showed up with her glove box envelope and a lawyer. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who looked like she had heard every HOA horror story in existence. The judge said, "This is a petition for a temporary restraining order based on harassment. Petitioner, present your case." I stood up and walked through the timeline, the edited minutes, the repeated violation notices, the attempted towing, the threats on camera, and the escalation after the board dismissed the violations. I played clips of the video showing Barbara directing the tow truck and threatening me on my own property. I showed the stack of certified mail notices, each one more aggressive than the last. The judge looked at Barbara and said, "Do you dispute any of this?" Barbara's lawyer stood up and said, "Your Honor, my client was acting within her authority as a board member. The petitioner is mischaracterizing routine enforcement as harassment." The judge said, "Routine enforcement does not include editing meeting minutes after the fact or attempting to tow vehicles that are legally parked." She looked at me and said, "Do you have proof the minutes were edited?" I handed her the screenshots and the cached original file. She read them carefully, then looked at Barbara and said, "Did you alter these minutes after the meeting?" Barbara said, "I clarified the language." The judge said, "That is not what I asked. Did you add new policy language that was not discussed or voted on?" Barbara hesitated. Her lawyer whispered something to her. She said yes, but it was consistent with the board's intent. The judge said, "Intent is not the same as a vote." She looked at the video clips again, then said, "I am granting a temporary restraining order. The respondent is prohibited from contacting the petitioner, entering his property, or issuing any further violation notices. The order is effective immediately and will remain in place pending a full hearing in 30 days. Barbara's face went red. She said, "This is outrageous. I was doing my job." The judge said, "Your job does not include harassment. If you violate this order, you will be held in contempt." She banged the gavel and said, "Next case." I walked out of the courthouse feeling like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Dennis clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You did good." The next day, I received an email from the Driftwood Crossing Management Company. It said the board had completed its audit and that a refund of fees that hits the ledger like a slap was being processed for all homeowners who had been fined under the invalid winter policy. My refund was $600. Linda texted me and said she got $300 back. The full restraining order hearing happened 4 weeks later. Barbara showed up with a different lawyer and a much quieter attitude. The judge reviewed the case, heard testimony from Dennis and 2 other neighbors, and made the restraining order permanent for 1 year. Barbara was also ordered to attend a mediation training course as a condition of staying on the HOA board in any capacity. But the board did not wait. 2 weeks after the hearing, they held a special election and removed Barbara from her position entirely. Carol took over as pool and amenities chair. The first thing she did was issue a public apology to everyone who had been targeted by Barbara's enforcement campaign. The policy rewrite took 3 months. The new winter rules were clear, reasonable, and voted on in a public meeting with full transparency. Snow piles were allowed on curb strips as long as they did not block mailbox doors. Reflective stakes were permitted. Overnight parking rules were clarified and applied evenly. The board also implemented a new appeals process that required third-party review before any fine could be enforced. Barbara moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. I heard through Linda that she had listed her house quietly and left without telling anyone. The new owners were a young couple with a dog. They waved at me when they moved in. One morning in early spring, I was outside clearing the last remnants of slush from my driveway when my phone buzzed. It was an email from Greg. He said the board had received a records request from a law firm representing 3 other homeowners who were filing a class action complaint against the association for improper enforcement practices during Barbara's tenure. The lawyer had requested all meeting minutes, correspondence, and financial records related to winter violations. Greg said the board was cooperating fully and that the association's insurance carrier was already involved. I forwarded the email to Dennis and said, "It is not over yet." He replied, "It never is with HOAs. But you started something. Other people are standing up now." A month later, I got a call from one of the homeowners in the class action. She said, "We used your inspection report and your video as evidence." The insurance company settled. Every homeowner who was fined under Barbara's enforcement is getting a full refund plus compensation for legal fees. The association is also revising the governing documents to include stronger oversight and an independent review board for all enforcement actions. I said, "That is incredible." She said, "You opened the door. The rest of us just walked through." The settlement was finalized in June. I received a check for $800 covering my fines, my inspection costs, and a portion of my legal fees. The association also issued a formal apology letter to every affected homeowner. The letter was signed by the full board and included a pledge to operate with transparency and fairness going forward. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage next to my reflective snow stakes, which I kept as a reminder. The following winter was quiet. The plow contractor came on schedule, the snow piles stayed on the curb strips, and no one got a violation notice. Carol ran the amenities committee with a light touch and common sense. The neighborhood group chat, which had been silent during Barbara's reign, came back to life with posts about snow day pictures, plow schedules, and reminders to check on elderly neighbors. One afternoon in December, I was shoveling my driveway when a car pulled up. It was the tow operator who had refused to hook my van. He rolled down his window and said, "Hey, I remember you. HOA drama guy." I laughed. "That is me." He said, "I heard what happened. Good for you. Those HOA board members think they can bully contractors too. I stopped taking calls from that neighborhood after your situation." I said, "I appreciate you standing your ground that morning." He nodded. "It is part of the job. I do not tow people just because someone with a clipboard tells me to." He waved and drove off. Dennis came over that night with a 6-pack and we sat in my garage with the door open, watching the snow fall. He said, "You know, you could run for the board." I said, "Absolutely not." He laughed. "Fair enough, but you changed this place. People are not afraid anymore." I said, "They should not have been afraid in the first place." He raised his bottle. To standing up. I clinked my bottle against his. To standing up. The next morning, I stepped outside to clear my driveway again. The snow was fresh and clean, and the air was sharp and cold. My reflective stakes stood in a neat line marking the edge of the grass. The snow pile sat on the curb strip, exactly where it was supposed to be. The mailbox door was clear. The sidewalk was wide. Everything was exactly as it should be. I planted my shovel in the snow and looked up at the gray winter sky. Somewhere across the neighborhood, I could hear the low rumble of a plow truck making its rounds. The sound was steady and reliable, a promise that the streets would be clear by morning. I hope your week goes smoothly.